welcome. It's for our first herb walk, and this is the first time I've had people here for a class, and my first time trying to record and do an herb walk at the same time, and also socially distance. But I'm just going to jump right in. So our first plant is in bloom now, yay! And that's elder. And I have been on the property. I just got asked a moment ago before I officially started recording. I've been on the property for almost 15 years, and the previous owner was interested in herbs and did Reiki and flower essences and all that stuff. She's much more spiritually focused than my herbalism is, but it's all good. And so a lot of plants were already on the property, but this particular whole stretch here was not. This was all just kind of woods, and some of it was just a drop off. And when we logged about 20, 30 trees off the property, we said, just put the wood chips there. And so they did, and it extended our yard by about 10 feet. And then after a couple of years, we put down manure, we did the whole lasagna thing, and then put down some baby seedlings, and it took our baby saplings, and it took several years. They say with perennials, they sleep, they creep, and then they leap, and that definitely happened over here. And in fact, we're gonna be cutting back and hopefully removing the two dogwoods that are just really scrappy looking and taking up valuable space that I'd like other plants to be in. But we'll talk about a few plants that are in this section here. And this is black elder. I got mine from Foundwell Farm, and it's a wild type. I might, in retrospect, have gone for one that was slightly more cultivated, like the John Adams one is one I've seen one of my colleagues growing, and that one produces a little bit better. But this one is doing great. It's just that it drops the berries just before they go ripe, so I can never get a good berry harvest. So I think I'm going to focus on flowers this year and then just buy my berries as I normally do. And we can use a lot of different parts of elder, but some of the ways that we would identify it first and foremost, and this is a common wild plant, so you will see it out and about, and now is the perfect time to look for it, because when they're in flower, it's like somebody shined a spotlight on where they all are. So if you wanted to go back and try to find them when they're in bloom, when they're in berry in the fall, now's a good time to kind of figure out where the stands are. And you can harvest the flowers as well. So usually it's a pretty robust shrub like this. There are a couple plants that could look a little bit similar, like water hemlock is one that does also have clusters of white flowers and divided or compound leaves, and it does like to grow in wet areas, but it's just a more diminutive wildflower growing out of the ground. It's not a shrub. And also, because this is a shrub, you're not going to find it in a lot of the wildflower identification guides, because wildflowers by definition die back to the ground in the winter time, and this is a shrub. It doesn't do that, and you can see where it's got all these woody stems that have persisted through the winter, and then the green shoots are the new growth this year, and then those will turn woody. So robust shrub. Some of the key features are that it has, and I do have this plant on my virtual herb walk too, so if you want like little reminders, you can go on the summer or basically it's on the spring through summer and fall for sure, maybe also spring herb walk pages on the virtual herb walk section of my website. But it's got opposite leaves, and so let me pull one of those off. I've grabbed an almost 6-foot stick, so later on if I need to point something out to you from a distance, I can. Grab this one here, thank you. So it has opposite leaves. So this whole structure here is technically one leaf, but it's a compound leaf. And compound means that it's made up of like smaller leaflets. And it's easiest to go back and like look at the stem and see how things are growing off the stem. And that might be an easier way to tell like what's a leaf versus a leaflet, because that can be a little confusing. Technically there's a node, and on these I'll let you look up, you can come by afterwards and take a closer look, but you can see a little dot here in the middle that indicates the node. But on some of our wildflowers it's so small it's not really obvious, so I would just kind of look to see where the main stem is and how are things branching off of it and get a vibe for it that way. And so usually you'll get anywhere from like 5 to 7 or maybe more leaflets on a leaf. And so the fact that it's opposite leaves and then divided leaflets is pretty distinctive first and foremost. There are a couple other things that have white flowers and compound leaves that are divided sort of similarly to this, but they're not growing opposite. Usually they're growing alternate, where there's one here and then one down here and one there. So so that's one key feature. And then the flower structure is I believe it's the corum state kind, but basically it's going to branch off and make a flat top cluster, but they're not going off in very specific ways. The umbels are in the parsley family, and those have like a very specific distance from, so you get like the middle and then there's like a shootout, kind of like a firework, and then there's another little spot, and then it divides once more, and then you have your flowers. That's a compound. Umbel. Compound just kind of means like, oops, I did it again. So sometimes you'll have like it's double compound or triple compound. And the parsley family, which is sometimes confused with this particular plant, is that umbel shape and specifically a compound. This one at first glance you might think it is, but then if you look at it, you'll notice that the way that it divides is a little bit more sporadic. It's not like one shoot and then one shoot again like that firework would be. And then when you look close up, they're little five petaled flowers, and they're just super cute. So definitely inspect that. And then in the fall, they produce like a blackish, bluish, purplish berry. And the deeper purple, the deeper blue, black they are, the more ripe they generally are. And they're usually pretty small, but different varieties and different species might have slightly larger berries, or they might have a little bit of a duskiness to it, especially the West Coast wild species. Now they're all considered to be Sambucus nigra, which is the European black elder, and all of our Sambucus canadensis, and then there's one with like a C in the species name that's out west. They're all just considered some subspecies of nigra, but they do have their slightly distinctive characteristics, and they're all used pretty much the same medicinally. There is a red elder, that's the racemosa, which is indicating that it's got a raceme style flower, and those are more like almost kind of like a spike in a way versus this flat top cluster. They bloom much earlier in like May. They're one of the first things to bloom, and then when they put out berries, they're bright red and they come out around midsummer. So you wouldn't normally mix them up because their bloom times, colors, shapes, fruiting times are all very different from black elder, but the red elder is moderately toxic, more so than the black elders are. So black elder, we can use the flowers, and you can just harvest them as whole clusters and then dry them and then use a fork to pull them off. Some people do work with them fresh, but generally speaking with elder, the safest way to work with it is to stick to berries or flowers and have them cooked or dried, because there are some cyanide-like compounds in all the elders, and there's less in the berries and the flowers. And then once you dry them or cook them, you've pretty much negated any health concerns that are associated with them. There are some slight medicinal benefits, so some of the antiviral activities actually do relate to those cyanide-like compounds, but you get the good stuff without the bad stuff if you cook or dry. With the elderflowers, they're even less of a toxicity concern than the berries would be when they're fresh. So you do sometimes see people making cordials and teas and infused waters and things like that with the flowers. You want to minimize the stems because the stems are higher in those cyanide compounds, and there are also very nauseating compounds, so sometimes it's hard to discern between nausea and poisoning with people, and that might be partly why we see some variation. Also, it's possible that the European species is not as like cyanide rich as the ones that we have in the wild out here. There have been a few poisonings of people like juicing fresh berries and then feeding it to a crowd, and then everybody ended up with a bit of cyanide toxicity. I can't remember if somebody died in that or not, but I would personally cook or dry the berries for sure before uses. If a few little stems get in, like you're harvesting berries or flowers and a few little stems get in, that's usually not an issue, but you really don't want to be getting a lot of stems or leafy material. And then the leaves can be used, but they're used topically. And if you follow Stephen Buhner, he believes that as long as you dry pretty much any part of elder, you can use it internally, but most herbalists don't generally concur with that. It's definitely more potential for nauseating it and also more potential for being moderately toxic. Once properly prepared, berries and flowers of this species and other black elder group species are very safe and usually really well tolerated. We use the flowers for flu and viral infections, but especially for breaking fevers and also reducing histamine. Those are the two main ways. It's a very cooling remedy by nature, but it first works by helping to vent heat. So it seems a little confusing if we're talking about energetics of hot or cold. This plant makes you sweat, so you would think like that's heating, But in a lot of systems of energetics, because it's venting the heat, they consider it cooling because it can bring down the fever or bring down the heat and inflammation in the body. And so you can do a tea, you can make a tincture, you could do a glycerin extract. It's very popular as a cordial if you've ever had Saint Germain and other sort of Saint Elder knockoffs of it. Saint Germain's kind of expensive. Pretty much it's the flowers and then a little bit of citrus or citric acid, like a lemony kind of flavor, and then a lot of sugar. And it's really, you know, quite tasty and botanical and divine. On its own, it's like okay tasting, but it definitely tastes better with the citrus and the sugar added in. And it's very popular for kids to use elderflower, and there are a lot of herbalists who are more fond of the flowers than they are of the berries because they feel like they're even more medicinal and have more of a wide variety of uses. The berries, when those come out, usually, again, you can cook or dry. I personally like to use them dry and then use them in syrups and recipes like we'll be making in our immune class, but they are even safer if you cook them, and there are a lot of fresh cooked berry recipes out there as well. And the berries have some seeds that are a little bit nauseating, so usually straining them out if you're sensitive to that. You know, when you make the syrup or if you make a tea, you steep them for a little while and then you strain them out, and then it's usually not a problem. But there are some people who even just like a little bit, if they're making like an elderberry pie or something like that, and then they're literally eating the berries with the seeds in them. Some people will be totally fine. Some people can eat the berries fresh and are totally fine. And then other people might have a little bit of a cooked berry and like vomiting profusely. So there is a very individual response to that. The berries are awesome antiviral. That's where they're most famous. They seem to go in and they block the receptors, or they really attach to the viral receptors, so that they make it harder for the virus to get into the cell, because viruses have to attach to your cells or whomever's cells, break into the cell, basically reprogram the cell to make more viruses, and then they explode out of the cell with all these, you know, new viruses, and that's how the viruses grow and spread. They can't really replicate on their own. They need to attach to a cell. So early on in an infection, or if you know you're likely to be exposed, taking elderberries, lemon balm is another plant that has somewhat similar actions, although more specific for herpes than for influenza and other flu-like things. But taking that at the early onset in pretty high doses, several times a day, will usually help avert the infection or help prevent it from being more severe. And there have been a lot of studies, or a handful of very good studies, on it helping to reduce the severity of illness. Not so much on averting it, but I use elderberry syrup, and I use the flowers and the berries together, plus a few other ingredients like we'll make in class. You actually kind of feel it working, after about, an hour or so, you're like, oh, I feel a lot better. And then if you wait 4 hours before you take another dose, you're like, ooh, I can feel those symptoms creeping back. And then you take another dose and you feel them, ideally you'd probably want to take it like every 2 hours or so you're not giving that virus a chance to fight back. But really good for that. Less useful once the illness is already really widespread, because at that point in time, blocking it out of the cells is less useful. It's still antioxidant and anti-inflammatory because it's a berry. It's a really deep blue, purple, black berry, but it doesn't have quite the same antiviral punch as it would early on. There's been a little bit of controversy, especially with coronavirus and cytokine storm, because there's been one study in a lab that found that it increased cytokines. Cytokines are chemical messengers that are usually, but not always, associated with inflammation, but they're immune in nature. And so they're part of a healthy immune response, but they can also get super out of control in a few rare extreme cases and then actually wreak havoc on the body. And we are seeing that in the more advanced, like hospitalization, life or death stages of COVID. And so there's some concern that's just been extrapolated that, well, because, and in this lab study, they were saying that was probably how it worked, was by supporting that cytokine immune response. But definitely we have more studies showing that blocking a viral effect too. And so there have been some folks who've extrapolated and said, well, it increases cytokines. Cytokines can go bad, so therefore this is actually dangerous in coronavirus. And there's really absolutely no evidence of that at all. It's probably helpful in early stages or prevention of coronavirus, but we really have no idea. There's been no research whatsoever on COVID-19 and elder, or really we have no idea about almost anything really that could be useful. We could extrapolate and think it's probably because it does seem to work for the common cold. It does seem to work in the studies for influenza and swine flu and H1N1. And there have been a few, I think they're all lab studies, but there have been some lab studies on other coronaviruses and have found that it also seemed to have that same viral blocking effect. So we can guess that it probably is helpful, but we don't know. And always listen to your body. If you take this and you feel worse, then it's not the right herb for you. Usually if you take this, you will either feel nothing or you'll feel better. So always with anything, be listening to your body. You can use the leaves and things. I don't use them internally like Stephen does. Stephen Buhner does use them dried internally as like teas and extracts for antiviral effect, but myself and most herbalists don't do that. But what you can use it topically for is you can make topical oils and salves, use it fresh or dry, or even just as a compress, and it works somewhat similar to arnica for bumps and bruises and aches and sprains and strains, and just kind of as a topical aches and pains remedy. So there is use for those topical parts that is very safe when you use it that way, but I have only limited experience with that particular use because I end up using comfrey more often for those kinds of things, and I get that even more abundantly in my garden, so I just tend to work with that. But yeah, so does anybody have any questions about elderberries?
So I just asked the question on drying.
Yeah.
I dried some of the flowers in the car doing the brown paper bag method, and I think I cooked them.
You might have cooked them.
Probably did.
So with flowers and berries, I do prefer to do those in a dehydrator versus a car method. I usually save like leafy things for the car method for one. And so that way you can control the temperature a little bit more, and you don't have the nights when things have a chance to like be cool and maybe ferment a little bit, because flowers are tricky because you have these very delicate petals that dry really quickly and can get over dried, but then you have middles that take a little bit longer, especially with some of our bigger flowers like say calendula or roses. So I usually will use a dehydrator set for anywhere between 95 to 110 degrees. And for something super delicate like elder, unless it was really humid like it is now, I'd probably keep it on the lower end of that. And then for berries, you want the temperature to be a little bit higher, but not too high. Also, right now, it's been so hot, and you know, you're even a little bit warmer zone than I am, and so putting things in the windshield of the car for almost any plant is probably going to be a little bit overkill right now. So if you get in the car, the ideal drying temperature is still for most of your flowers and leaves is between 95 and 110 or so. If it's a little above 110, and it might be okay, but it's still, you know, you really don't want it much higher than that because you're going to cook all the aromatics and the more delicate components out of the plants. So you can actually put a thermometer in your car, or just kind of judge it. So if you get in the car and you're like, oh, it's kind of warm, you know, that's probably okay. But if you get in the car and you're like, we're gonna die if we don't open the windows right now, that's too hot for the herbs to be in the windshield. That's kind of a good assessment. And so you could try putting them in a shadier spot on the seat of the car. Some people actually hang sheets over the car and then put them in the sheets kind of strapped up or down underneath it. Some people will use the trunk. Just make sure your trunk is, you know, wherever you're putting it, make sure it's clean so that it's not being exposed to, you know, germs and things from whatever goes in and out of, you know, shoes and things that might be going in and out of the car. Or you can do some other method. Lately, I've been doing a lot more because I'm not as attentive to get like to check on things perfectly. I'm just too busy. I'll hang them on screens with a fan underneath inside the house and get them most of the way dry. And then when I'm ready to garble them, I'll put them out in the morning and so into the car to crisp them up that last little bit to make sure they're totally dry, and then we'll garble and process them more in the like afternoon or so, and that usually seems to work pretty well. But I'm really, part of the reason I buy a lot of dried herbs is I just don't have a great setup to be able to do large quantities in a perfectly clean environment. We're in the woods, rodents and other things are problems. So, but you can play around with your various options. But yeah, it is a little too hot in the car right now for drying things, in the windshield at least. So I will leave this here. Does anybody want to come on up and take a peek?
The flowers then is what turns.
Yes, that's the way of the birds and the bees of flowers, is that if they get pollinated and the conditions are right, they'll make babies, and the babies are the seeds inside of the fruits. So each flower hopefully will ultimately turn into a fruit, and so they'll start off green and then they'll go, and you'll see them like as the things fertilize, you'll notice that the little green bit in the middle gets bigger and bigger and then eventually starts to ripen and change color. Usually this is going to be, here in New Hampshire, we start to see them ripen in late summer, like late August, early September. The birds love elder, and so you kind of also have to compete with the birds for when so the birds don't get to them. Some people will put little nets over them as they get close to ripening so the birds can't get to them. I don't really worry about it, and also I have my issue that they drop their berries anyway, regardless of the birds. So I did throw some compost down at the suggestion of Deb Sewell to see if that maybe will help them hold on to their berries a little better.
Oh, really?
We'll see. She's wondering if maybe there was a fertility. I mean, the soil's actually pretty decent in here, but maybe there was a soil fertility thing and that caused them to drop their berries. I suspect too that it might be a variety thing too, but because it's not one of the most, it's not a really cultivar of elderberry. And while you usually with medicinal plants don't go for the fancy cultivars, in the case of elderberry, it's not especially if you're going for a berry harvest, going for the cultivars doesn't hurt, or getting more of a European type of elderberry versus the American one might be a little bit, I'm just extrapolating, but I'm going to guess it's going to be a little less nauseating, and also maybe bigger berries as well. So this is yarrow here, and there's probably also, if I start to look, a lot of yarrow. Now granted, everything's kind of drying to a crisp right now, and we've been mowing, but you might be able to see that there's yarrow growing all through the lawn. And I like to think of yarrow kind of like, and this is something I learned from Michael Moore, who is one of my main herbal teachers, but you can kind of think of this as the mycelium of a mushroom, and how like you have all this growth happening that's not the fertile part of the plant, and then eventually, when the conditions are just perfect, with the mushrooms, they send up a fruiting body, which is what's going to produce spores and allow it to reproduce. With yarrow, it actually sends up the flowering stalks. So often where you see yarrow tall and in bloom, if you look around, there'll actually be a lot of it just growing like through this dense network of root systems, and you'll see leaves just kind of throughout the area, and then where it's perfect and it's not getting mowed or whatever, you'll get the flowering stalks. And you can use any of that, if you had time to kill and you needed to because there wasn't that much yarrow in bloom around you, you could go on your hands and knees and pick individual leaves out of the lawn or out of the field and use that as medicine. You can also use the flowers and the stems. So this is perfect harvesting time right now. And I would personally harvest, a pretty good amount of the plant. I might do like the top 1/3, the top 1/2. I don't want to be so harsh that it's going to be hard on the plant, and I always like to leave some flowers behind so that it can continue to live out its cycle the way that it naturally would. We want to be nice to our plants, but you can use any part. Or if you were somebody who was maybe a little iffy around daisy family flowers, you might do okay with the leaves but not the flowers. So it depends on the person. And you can dry this and use it for tea. You can use it fresh in tincture. I mostly use it fresh in a tincture or an alcohol extract. You could do pretty much whatever you want with it. The flavor is all right. It's not great. It's not terrible. It's a little bitter. It's a little aromatic. Mine at least are a little bit piney. I don't know if that's because of where I am or if that's how they usually are, because I don't have an opportunity. I don't get around to taste other people's yarrow as much as my own. And it's probably most famous for being able to chew up the leaves and apply it to wounds. Achillea is the genus name, which is after Achilles, because this was a traditional wound wart for soldiers, and Achilles is the god of war. And so this is a very long term use of it, to use the leaves or just use medicine, but especially to use the fresh leaf poultice on wounds to help stop bleeding. And also at the same time, it helps disinfect and helps it heal better. So it has a lot of different actions for the wounds that are great. Usually you'll notice that it heals up super fast with minimal scarring and less pain and less bleeding, which is great. You can also make like a dilute tincture so that it's not super high in alcohol, or take your tincture and dilute it in water and use that to clean a wound, and that would be another great way to use it. You could also do a vinegar extract and use that to clean a wound. So it's good in a variety of ways, although the fresh leaf poultice is definitely the most famous of the ways to use it. It's also an insect repellent topically, so again, like either a vinegar or an alcohol extract that you spray would be classic, and there have been good studies on mosquitoes as well as ticks showing really good repelling, which is nice because it's not, most of our natural remedies for repelling insects and ticks are very aromatic, so maybe you're just not an essential oil person And the essential oils definitely have to be reapplied very frequently. It's like, it's almost as effective as DEET for 5 minutes. And then like how effective it is drops very quickly. I haven't seen longevity studies and like how long this is effective, but there's more to it than just the aromatics for sure. And also if you're just somebody who doesn't like strong smells, you could make a tincture and use that as a spray, and hopefully it will work. There's been some research of the military groups on using it as an insect repellent.
Would it be better to use as an insect repellent vinegar versus alcohol?
You can do either way. The alcohol is probably a little better at extracting it, but vinegar isn't bad because it's not irritating. It smells funny, so that might be a little bit of a deterrent. But if you were using it on bug bites or wounds or skin things like that, the vinegar is going to be nicer on the skin. So, you know, it is versatile that way. I personally work with it in an alcohol format just because it's easy for me to make tinctures with everything.
Yeah. No, that's what I was thinking, because sometimes the alcohol kind of...
Yeah, alcohol is kind of irritating. If you knew that you were just going to be using it for topical use, you could use like a lower proof, like a 40% or 80 proof alcohol, your regular vodka, versus the, you know, 95% alcohol, 190 proof. Did I say a question?
I've mostly used it for stopping bleeding.
Yep.
Is there a way to preserve it in the off season? Like, will the dried plant also stop bleeding?
You can try drying it and powdering it and then applying that powder to the wound to help stop bleeding. That's another way that it's sometimes used. I haven't tried it because I don't have bleeding wounds that often, so I don't get around to trying things out very much, but for that kind of situation, but I know that that's one of the ways that you can use it, so you can give that a try. And I do like the tincture for a lot of its uses as well. So this is a plant that does have alternating leaves. This one's in the composite family versus elder, which is at least loosely in the honeysuckle family. But they're kind of similar in that they both could get confused with some of our potentially toxic parsley family plants. So again, it's not actually an umbel of a flower. So if you look close up, you'll see that it doesn't have that structure. And technically, this is in the composite family. So each one of these flowers is actually many flowers. So if you had really good eyesight, each one of these little petals is actually a flower in and of itself, and then in the middle there are several other petalless flowers in the middle. So it's a composite, and that's why daisy family plants are so easy to be allergic to, is because you have so many flowers on these plants, because then you've also got clusters of these little flowers. Together we kind of call this alla inflorescence, but I mean, I don't even know. There are probably well over 100 or more flowers in this particular flower head. And so many of those are producing pollen from their male reproductive parts. And so they're just tremendous pollen producers. And so that's part of the reason why we see a lot of allergies with the composite family. Ragweed's in it. Ragweed's particularly special because it's more wind pollinated. So not only does it have a ton of pollen, but it also is really teeny tiny pollen that's designed to like release to the wind in mass quantities. And so these guys are fertilized more by, or pollinated more by, bees and insects and things like that. So you can still be allergic to them, but it's usually not as much of a problem as ragweed. And let's see, we also have alternating, so instead of opposite, in this case it's alternating leaves, which is not going to set it apart from the parsley family plants, unfortunately, but the leaves are divided. So technically this is one leaf, but you'll notice that it's divided multiple times. So it is another like compound divided. Divided is a term that's used more by newcombs. Compound is the term that most other botanists will use for how a leaf is divided up. Some places will call this a compound leaf, and some places will call this a divided leaf. This is a little funny when you're keying it out, because different people think that like, oh, there are a bunch of individual leaflets, and some say, oh no, it's just really finely like broken down, but it's still just one leaf. And so just be aware that that can be a little tricky when you're looking in the field guides for yarrow. It has hair on the stems, and so that's somewhat distinctive, although Queen Anne's lace, which is also in the parsley family but it's not as toxic, it also has hairy legs. So, but the flower structure would be one of the key ways that you would differentiate it from those poison plants. Let's see, millefolium, because million-leafed or thousand-leafed. because of the leaf structure. So this is a plant that has so many different uses. One of my favorite ways to use it is as an antimicrobial herb, whether it's internally or externally, because as we already mentioned, it helps stop bleeding, it helps disinfect, it's antimicrobial, it helps heal, so it's vulnerary. Vulnerary is the term that we use for things that actually will go in and help heal wounds and heal tissue that's damaged or wounded or irritated or inflamed, so it brings that down. It's also tightening and toning by nature, so it'll help astringe the tissues a little bit. It's a gentle one there. Internally, some additional benefits is it gets the juices moving. So it'll actually improve blood flow, it'll improve digestive juice function, it'll improve digestion. So it's a great herb for leaky gut, but at the same time, it will help heal up and tone up the tissues. It'll help fight pathogens. It'll help, with a lot of different things down the line. It's often used for digestion internally and also used for cardiovascular health because it does help improve the integrity of the blood vessels and help stop bleeding, but then also improve healthy blood flow through the blood vessels. And you'll see it being used topically for all sorts of things. Sitz baths for women who just had a baby to help heal that tissue up. I've had clients use it for things like rectal fissures and infections that were happening in that neck of the area, to just kind of use it as a gentle wash or a sitz bath for them. So sitz baths aren't just for ladies, guys can use them too. Certainly for wounds, insect repellents. This is a plant that has, it seems like, almost every action, all your herbal actions, like vulnerary and antimicrobial and astringent and bitter and carminative, and it's just got like almost every herbal action you could think of. It seems like this plant has. It's not a nervous system tonic. It's not so it's not a nervine. It's not an adaptogen. There are a few things it doesn't do, but it really does quite a lot. So you could play around with yarrow. It's even been used in some traditional cultures for divination, for foretelling the future. With the I Ching in Chinese herbal medicine and Chinese, culture, they'll use sticks to toss, and then how those sticks land will determine what the future holds. And people will sometimes use yarrow because it has a very nice straight stick, and it's a plant that's often associated with a lot of lore and magic. And so sometimes they'll use the sticks of yarrow. As a flower essence, yarrow is used for protection, especially though in different colors will have different activities, but the white is usually seen as just kind of like helping to protect from taking on other people's energies. So, when you walk into a room and that person had a headache and now you had a headache, or you walk into a room and everybody's grumpy and now you're grumpy, yarrow is a plant that as a flower essence is often used to help kind of create a little bit of protection from the negative energies that might be around you. And other colors of yarrow are used for, protecting the heart or protecting your money or protecting different things. But usually for medicine, the only one that we use medicinally is the wild white type. The other ones might have activity, but this is the key one. So any questions about yarrow? I should probably do it.
Would you use the leaf or the flower to make teas?
You can use the leaf and or the flower. So any of that is useful. If you had a issue with allergies and you wanted to give, you may be allergic to yarrow, but if you wanted to be a little bit on the safer side, the leaves are less likely to be allergenic. I've used it as a mouth rinse because of all those same uses that we talked about. It's also nice as a mouth rinse to tighten and tone and fight infections and that kind of thing. I personally, I don't do that well with daisy family flowers, and I don't know if it's the sesquiterpene lactones or what, but with yarrow it does make me a little wheezy, and then it will actually irritate my gums, but that's unusual. For most people it would be very soothing for the gums. I'm a weirdo and I have like bizarre reactions to lots of things, so don't take that to mean this can inflame the gums, because normally it would actually soothe them. So this is a magnolia tree. They can be really beautiful, and some people are surprised because they think of magnolias as being a southern tree, but really, like, you can get different, there are a few species that grow quite nicely in the North Country, and you can use the flowers as medicine. They're quite lovely, but the bark is actually even more useful, and I really love this like green happy bark that you get. And so I would just prune this and then pull off the leaves and then shave the bark or chop up the twigs to use as medicine. Alcohol is a pretty good way to extract that. You could also do vinegar if you wanted to do an alcohol-free method. And I really love the way the juicy younger ones work. I'll prune a little bit of both. So I usually, contrary to the way you do most barks of being early spring or late fall, you can do any time for magnolia bark, but I personally feel like I get the most juiciness and scent out of the late midsummer when I have lots of nice green growth branches. And I'll let you all come up and take a quick whiff, but it's got this really nice kind of lemony, root beery kind of also. You can each pick a different one and we'll try to be sort of nice to it. There we go. That one actually smelled the most, was in there. So you might want to you can take a different branch than mine if you don't want to stick your nose to the same thing I just put my nose to, but just do a little scratch and sniff and then apologize to the magnolia for doing a scratch and sniff because it does open her up for a few diseases, and these are very disease prone trees. But the bark is really what we're using for medicine, and we will talk about it in class, but it's great for sleep, cortisol, balancing, anxiety, and many, many other things. So if you feel like now or later taking a little whiff of that, you can. And we'll save talking about it for class time.
Which variety is that?
This particular one is a child of a hybrid, so it's got sort of whatever genetics, but it's the child of a combination of a stellata and a cobus. So it was a stellata cobus cross. It was the Dr. Merrill magnolia, and then this is a child of that one. And you can actually see there are some critters hanging out on it that will have to come and hand remove later on, because this is a plant that is very susceptible to pests and infections, more so than other trees are. It doesn't have as many tannins or astringent protective properties in the bark, and so it makes it a little bit more tempting for critters because it doesn't have this nasty tasting, slightly poisonous astringent chemical, or at least not as much of it in the bark as some of the other trees do. So you often see beautiful magnolias and you often see diseased and dying magnolias. So here we have California poppy, which really likes dry, sunny, warm spots because it grows wild in just the open in California. Some people will plant it in their lawns. It's an annual, but maybe in its own environment it survives the winter. I've kind of heard mixed things about that, but it's pretty good at self-seeding, and here it's definitely an annual. And so this is a great time to harvest it, or you can wait for a few more seed pods to appear. These little pieces right here, these are flowers that are beginning to open, but then after they flower, and this just started blooming this week, but after they go by, they produce a little tiny green seed pod. And so if you harvest it while it's in flower and seed, and you get the whole plant, including the root, usually a little bit later in summer, but before it starts to get really scruffy, is a great time to harvest it. And you can make tinctures, you can also dry it. The root is stronger than the above ground parts, but they're all useful. And traditionally you hear people mostly using the leaves and the aerial parts, but I was taught to use the whole plant, and the roots are definitely going to give a little bit more. The roots are its cool, translucent, orangey yellow color. They're pretty wild looking. And we use this for sleep. So we're going to talk about it in tonight's class a little bit, but it's oftentimes used for helping with people's sleep cycles. So if they're waking and falling asleep at not quite the ideal times, then California poppy would often be used for that. And the idea of it being that with the doctrine of signatures, this is a plant that will follow the sun and open and close with the sun. So the idea of this plant goes to sleep at night. When the sun goes down, it goes to sleep. So hopefully when the sun goes down, you'll be able to go to sleep too. It's also a little bit pain relieving. It's not a knock your socks off pain reliever, but it does help with pain. It's nowhere near as strong as the opioid classes of poppies, but it's kind of sort of similar without actually containing opioids. And so if you had pain issues that were preventing you from sleeping, this might be one of the herbs that you would consider taking or throwing into a formula for that. And it's also used when people are just kind of bratty and agitated and irritated, whether you're kids or adults. Maybe a good time for some California poppy. So that's just kind of the short bit on California poppy, since we're going to be talking about it. But it's such a beautiful plant. I recommend getting up close and personal with those flowers because they're just gorgeous. So any questions about California poppy? I usually do throw a seed packet down. I've only been good about doing it in the springtime, but I hear that it does quite well if you plant it in the fall, just scatter the seeds in the fall, and that will give it even a little bit more chance to root and grow. And I've had mixed luck with planting it in other places, but this spot is just like cozy enough, plus there's enough exposed soil, because that's, you know, for get seeds to grow, they kind of need a little bit of a bare spot. I've got a lot of that in the lawn, but this one would like slightly better soil than I have for sand in the lawn.
It is an annual or perennial?
Here, at the very least, it's an annual. So treat it as an annual, but you can plant the seeds in the fall or the spring. And it will seed itself usually too. So once you have some, you'll often have more, but if you want to make sure you've got a lot of it, you could also plant some seeds too. But if I did plant a set of seeds, but I probably would have had at least a couple plants. And you can make a pretty good amount of tincture with even just 1 or 2 plants. So you don't necessarily need a ton, but they're pretty, and they just sort of bloom off and on. They'll get scraggly towards the end of the year, but they'll bloom for a good part of the summer, as annuals tend to do. Annuals usually, because they only have that one chance of setting seeds, they'll usually bloom for a much longer period of time versus your perennials that are like, ooh, you blinked and now they're gone by, which is like the Meadowsweet that we're gonna probably come to next.
I have a harvesting question.
Yeah.
So I'm fairly new. I'm probably the newest one.
Oh, I'm sure you're not the newest, but.
But how I came to see you is because I bought the gardening book. My husband and I were moving to a new house, and I had intentions of doing an herbal garden. And now my herb garden is flowering, and it's beautiful. So what I'm finding myself doing, I don't know if this is right, is cutting the flower, like the calendula. It's like 1 or 2 flowers at a time. So I'm actually drying 1 or 2 flowers at a time, right? Is that kind of the cycle?
Yes, yeah, for something like calendula where it's an annual, so if you don't deadhead it, it's gonna like go by a little bit more quickly, which I don't usually worry about that with California poppy, but with calendula, that's the medicinal part you're using. And if you don't harvest the flowers, it's gonna be like, okay, I did my job, see y'all later, or don't see y'all, see my babies later. And so if you keep pinching off the flowers and you can dry them or use them fresh in medicine, it'll keep branching out and making more and more. And so that's a great way to work with it. And I don't know how many plants you have, but usually as things get going, you'll get more and more. So I usually get several plants, and then I kind of fill like 1 tray of the dehydrator. I do like the dehydrator better for calendula if you're going to dry it, because it takes a while for those middles to get totally dry. So you just have to be really careful with those. Flowers I usually do in a single layer in the dehydrator, more so than in the car.
I only have 1 plant, so it's like 2 flowers at a time.
You could probably, I mean, it's so warm out, and calendula, I mean, you don't really want to overcook it, but the properties that are in calendula are not as sensitive as some other ones, so a little bit of heat is probably okay.
Well, chamomile, so I'm finding myself clipping chamomile.
Yeah, chamomile's the same way. And we do have chamomile in the garden too. But yeah, a little bit at a time. What's that?
It blooms fast.
Yes, yeah, totally. Chamomile especially, like, blooms fast and then it'll go by really quickly. But the more you harvest those flowers, the longer it'll like, oh, I gotta produce, like, shoot, I was just about to set those seeds. I gotta produce more flowers so I can, you know, so you'll get more plant material and more harvest, but it is a lot of hand picking, which is why calendula and chamomile cost so much, because flowers require a lot more effort than harvesting, you know, a bunch of leafy growth or something like that. They're such small, especially chamomile. Those flowers are so small. One of my colleagues, Lior Sade, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but Bee Fields Farm in Wilton, New Hampshire, and she does a lot of her own growing and then makes teas, and they're just impeccable quality. But she was talking about, she's like, have you tried harvesting chamomile? Like, people are like, oh, do you make chamomile tea? She's like, no, I don't sell chamomile tea. Like, that would be so much effort for like 1 bag of tea. She's like, it's just not economical for me to do. You know, maybe she'll throw a few flowers into a blend to just give it a little bit of the flower vibe, but she doesn't like sell like a bag of dried chamomile, because it's just with hand picking and all that, it's just not economical to resell. So you could buy them from farms, and they're usually using equipment and all that, but it's still one of the more expensive things you'll find. We have Marshmallow that's just about to bloom, and I highly recommend just like petting it, because it's so soft and fuzzy, and this is like a soft, soothing plant. It's really great for being slimy and soothing the digestive system. And it's usually used as tea. It's high in mucilage, and mucilage is very slimy, especially on contact with water. So tea or gruel or something like that, powder that you just mix in water and slug. The roots are more famous, and you can definitely use the roots, but the leaves are also nice, very similar in action, maybe not quite as slimy, but still good, and really great tea ingredient. It tastes good as a tea. It's just mild, but you can combine it with other more flavorful herbs like peppermint or fennel seeds or Korean licorice mint, which I have growing all along the house, although that's not usually where I harvest from because it's next to the house, but it pops up in the garden too, and that's a great tasty herb for digestion. And so you can use any of those to flavor, and then the marshmallow just kind of holds everything together, gives your tea a little bit of a velvety feeling from that mucilage, but the leaves are not quite so slimy. So some people might think that means they're not as healing, but sometimes that's actually nice to have it be a gentle mucilage versus this like sludge that you're drinking. It's definitely more palatable, and it's easier to harvest the flowers in abundance. So I'd usually just trim back some stems, hang them to let them dry most of the way, and then crisp them up once they're most of the way dry in the car to then process, because it'll take a while. If I put them all in the paper bag, the stems are so thick and juicy that even though they're creating a little airflow, they're also adding a lot of moisture, so these might not be so helpful to do in the car, at least right away. But yeah, you can harvest the leaves. It's going to have pretty, like, kind of very pale pink flowers. And then in the fall or the early spring, you could harvest the roots, but it's so easy to just buy marshmallow roots and then keep your plants to grow back, unless you're moving a plant and you don't want it there anymore. I personally would just focus on using the leaves, and you can make a lot of dried leaf material from this. And if a few flowers get in, that's totally fine. I love getting a few little flowers. As long as the plant still looks happy, you can use the flowers in with it too. So any questions about marshmallow?
No,
Some people,
I love how you have your mint throughout.
oh yeah, this is the lemon balm here, and it planted, my main one was in the garden, and then it died last year, like not this past winter, but the winter before, but it also self-seeded everywhere. So it self-seeded where it was, and then it's just like shown up everywhere. So I have lots of babies. If anybody wants to bring home lemon balm babies, I have babies to share, and you could also harvest lemon balm to make medicine with if you want to just harvest plant material. But I love lemon balm. I use a lot of it, so I'm not upset. I have actually weeded some of it out because it's been growing, and I've given a lot of it away. But it is a great plant. I just recently cut it back because we've had a lot of chewing bugs lately. So I was like, well, we'll make a tincture, and then we'll, it'll freshen up so that the next batch will hopefully have a chance to grow in a little happier. Some people, one of the downsides to mucilage is that especially for the roots, and especially the root powder, which is the most slimy, sometimes people who have digestive systems that don't do well with fibers and starches, so these would be folks who get gassy and bloated when they eat beans and apples and bread and things like that, really bother them. Garlic, onions also usually really bother those folks as well. The marshmallow root especially might be a problem, but I feel like the marshmallow leaf is usually fine. So it's just such a nice, like, it's got the medicinal activity, but it's not over the top. So it tends to be pretty well tolerated by even folks who avoid those quote unquote FODMAP foods. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about FODMAPs in the digestion class, but those will be those complex starchy plants that upset some people who don't have healthy gut microbiomes. This is another good plant that's known for digestion as well as other things, and it's just starting to bloom now, so if anybody wants to harvest a branch or two to play with, and you can use the leaves and the flowers. The flowers are really like the gentlest and nicest part of the plant. However, the flowers are very sporadic in their bloom. This is just starting to flower, so nobody's gone by yet. Tomorrow these flowers will have gone by, and they'll be like little hole punches. All the little petals look like somebody punched little tiny hole punches all over the garden. And the leaves are certainly more abundant, and they will also start to go by as the plant's starting to near the end of its bloom stage. Even the leaves won't be too happy. So this is beautiful, happy, vibrant right now, and I would probably harvest, most of a stem, leaving a couple sets of leaves behind, and use the leaves and the flowers. Or I might harvest just some flowers and a few random leaves here and there, whatever you wanted to do. This is Meadowsweet. Filipendula ulmaria is the one. There are some other meadowsweets that may not have the same medicinal property, but the Filipendula is ulmaria is the one that is. Ulmaria means it's ulmus, almost. It's has elm-like leaves because it's got the serrated, rough edges. The shape of the leaf is actually a little bit different, but it's also serrated, and both the elm leaves and the meadowsweet leaves have this kind of rough feeling to them. And this does have some methyl salicylate as well as some other salicylic compounds, and these are good for relieving pain. It's subtle in its effects, but it's kind of like a very mild aspirin-like remedy, but it tastes good, which is nice because the more high salicylate ones like willow bark and aspen taste like chewing aspirin. This one does not. And this one has a little bit of the methyl salicylate, which is what gives the wintergreeny flavor, and it's also in your black birch and your wintergreen, but it's in more toxic potential levels in those plants, whereas in meadowsweet it's just this gentle little fuzz. So it gives it this nice sweet flavor, hence the name meadow because it grows in the meadow, and sweet because it tastes sweet. It is also a little bit astringent and maybe a tiny bit mucilaginous, but really it's more astringent. And so if you don't want that tightening, toning astringency, and there's some bitter flavor associated with that, using the cooler water extracts will give you more of the pain relief without as much of the astringency. And or a lot of times if I have somebody with this irritated gut that needs some reduced inflammation in the gut, which is something that meadowsweet is very specific for, but needs to be softened, those astringent properties need to be softened, I'll combine it with meadowsweet and with marshmallow. And marshmallow's mucilage will extract just perfectly in hot or cold water. So you could even do like a cool or cold water tea of these and it would be quite nice, or hot, either way, but you'll get more of those astringents.
Is that why you planted them?
No, actually my thoughts for planting things near each other just sort of happened that way. I had some plants that I needed to move, and this was a new garden, so I was like, we'll put it over here because I need, I had all of this was all in that bed there, and then I moved half of it over here, and now they're both really big and beautiful. So meadowsweet is unusual in that most of your anti-inflammatory plants that are kind of like your aspirins and your ibuprofens, it's much gentler than that, but a lot of them irritate the gut and cause an increased risk of bleeding and all that other stuff. Even the herbs, while not as irritating as aspirin and ibuprofen, are still a little irritating. Meadowsweet is special because it's actually useful for reducing inflammation in the gut and helpful for ulcers and gastritis and those kinds of things. And if you did have somebody with that sensitive gut, I would probably just combine it with marshmallow leaves in a tea format. You can also make baths in it, and that can help with aches and pains and sprains. You can use it for other types of pain, but it is kind of like feeble. It's not our strongest. If you have a really bad headache, you can try some meadowsweet, but you may end up needing to take something else, whether it's wood betony or ibuprofen for it. So that's a really nice herb as well. Yeah, so we've got rhubarb over there with the big yellowy flowers. There's the yellow plant here, and Maria, I'm just going to kind of sneak in there. But we've got some arnica in bloom here. This is the meadow arnica, so it's not the arnica montana, but it's the one that grows pretty well here, and so it self-seeds and comes back. It might be perennial. Here, I'll move over here so I'm not like as close to you guys. It might be perennial, but it's definitely a self-seeder. And so I had one plant that I bought from Companion Plants through the mail, and then it just really likes this spot, and so I've been purposefully, like, when it goes to seed, some of the flowers I harvest before they go to seed, but if they do, I just kind of sprinkle them around and try to keep that area clear from mulch until the plants come up so that they have a chance to self-seed. So really great there. We've got the daisies and then the chamomile. We've got this plant here, which there's another bigger one over there, is the wood betony, and it will have really pretty purple flowers very soon. It's so pretty in the garden, and it has so many uses, but we will talk briefly about it in class. But it's used for digestion, it's used for pain, it's an antispasmodic, it's used for kind of calm the nervous system. It's a good nervous system tonic or nervine. So really nice plant, very easy to grow in the garden. We've got some meadowsweet, but not some meadowsweet, but some motherwort. And there's some more actually over by Acacia. There's some hiding amongst the marshmallow with little pink flowers. And that would be your motherwort, and we're going to talk about that. That's one of my favorite anxiety herbs and relaxing herbs. This one that's purple in bloom right now is sage, just regular garden sage in bloom. Very happy. This one here is this is lamb's ear, which I don't use it similar. I don't know of any medicinal uses for it, but it is a really pretty plant in the garden, and it is in the same genus as wood betony is. So, you know, it does have a sort of similar flowering structure, even though the colors are very different. And for umbels, we have 3 plants that are in umbel, right?
Good toilet paper.
Good toilet paper, possibly. I haven't used it. Sometimes you'll hear of mullein being used as toilet paper as well, but the hairs of mullein are a little bit irritating to some people, so you'll want to test it out on your face cheek before you test it out on your butt cheek to find out whether or not you're... I stole that from Jim McDonald. He's a funny herbalist. We've got some parsley that actually came back this year that has that umbel shape flower, and then we've also got lovage. You might end up in this shot. We've got some lovage in flower, and so this is your compound umbel. Very like parsley on steroids. It's not looking so happy right now. It's not in bloom yet, and it's being chewed up by bugs, but that's all skullcap over there. And you can smell, I've got some anise hyssop here and here, which is very similar to Korean licorice mint. Neither of them are in bloom yet, but they're so similar looking. You can use them similarly, but I encourage you to smell or taste a leaf, like just pull a leaf off and taste and smell it of each, and you'll notice that the Korean licorice mint is so much yummier, I think. This is another compound umbel. This is the Angelica, Arch Angelica that I planted, and the seeds are used as a digestive carminative. We've got some valerian that's still in bloom that probably smells sort of nice right now. We use the roots, and we'll talk about that for sleep. I'm gonna bump over to that bed. We've got some beautiful mullein, so if you wanted to grab a leaf or two for lung health, you can. But also I've got this, I love bronze fennel, and so this is really beautiful right now. It's delicious, and I highly encourage making vinegars, infused waters, seltzers, and glycerin extracts with them. The glycerin comes out purple, the vinegar comes out magenta, and they taste good. So,
What parts do you harvest?
for this, I would just harvest like just pull off, or not pull off, but cut off some leaves here and there, and I would use the fronds. This particular one, while it's got a beautiful color and a delicious Good and Plenty like flavor, it does not produce a big bulb. So it's not a bulb plant like some of the other fennels are.